George and I are joined today by Henry Stanley. Henry is the co-founder and chief product officer of Fabrik. Henry, welcome.
Hey, Mike George, thank you so much for having me. Nice to see you.
Yeah,
Nice to
thanks
meet
for
you.
joining us. So we found you, Henry, through a nice, provocative little LinkedIn post that actually kind of blew up on LinkedIn. It was pretty fun to see all of the reactions to that. Um, and it was about the efficacy of a SOC 2. And we thought that was pretty fun. But we will get into that. We'll get into that in a little bit. I think first and foremost, though, we want to let's talk about you as a leader in the GRC space and your journey. So can you tell us a little bit about yourself? Tell us about Fabrik, how you got there, and maybe we'll ask you some questions about that.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, that's funny that you came across me that way. Wasn't my LinkedIn post. All I did was, tap a few folks in who I knew would have some spicy thoughts and opinions. But yeah, I appreciate the introduction. So, like you mentioned, I'm Henry Stanley. I'm Chief Product Officer and co-founder of Fabrik. Fabrik is on a mission to make instant assessments available anywhere for the enterprise trust ecosystem. It's a data connectivity platform, and I'm happy to tell you more about kind of how we got here and kind of why we're on that mission. But um, my background has always been at the intersection of GRC, kind of infrastructure and dev tools, and that's always been a passion point of mine about building tools and enabling others to achieve their goals and kind of bring them together and rallying them. So that's always been kind of like a theme for me in my career. I've worked at companies like Spotify, where I was securing and deploying infrastructure globally for all of the playback systems kind of across the organization. At companies like Clear, where I was securing biometric identities, leading security and compliance initiatives for FedRAMP High, audits with the TSA and Homeland Security. So I have a pretty robust experience across a number of different domains where I've been focusing on bringing teams together around security, compliance, and infrastructure challenges, and finding that common ground that we all know and love between balancing friction with business enablement and opportunity. So that's been a big theme for me as well.
Thanks for breaking through that.
Yeah.
Okay. All right, so Henry, let's talk a little bit about this post that got our attention. So it wasn't your post, like you said, but the post that we found was, it said SOC 2 is a joke and every startup knows it, but no one wants to talk about it. And it's a racket that Vanta has pulled on the ecosystem. And then it goes on to talk a little bit more. And then one of the top comments was yours, and you said, I think that you'll find that many people actually do want to talk about this over on GRC LinkedIn, which is not a real thing, but it's like the people who are talking about this stuff on LinkedIn. So like, is SOC 2 a joke? I guess, like, take it away.
It's sock to a joke. Look, by no means am I like the expert voice and the authority on this topic. What I have found, though, is that there are a lot of people who are passionate about this, and I think that they should be. Um, you know, for all intents and purposes, SOC 2 is a de facto standard for a number of different kind of use cases in the GRC world, right? It's kind of a primary, sort of reporting standard that you would use to demonstrate your control effectiveness and demonstrate your assurance posture. And it's been sort of co-opted into this kind of common standard for establishing trust for TPRM and vendor risk specifically. So because of that, I think what's really happening here and kind of what is on display here is a symptom of a lot of the incentives that exist across many participants and stakeholders in this ecosystem. What do I mean by that? What I mean is that when it comes to trust and assurance and demonstrating your control effectiveness, there are clear incentives to want to kind of put forth as clean, healthy, and robust a posture as possible, so that you can move through a procurement cycle, close a deal, and align with what your buyer is expecting of you. And a whole host of platforms and services and tools have sprung up to make that process as frictionless as possible. Now, I don't think it's any one constituent's fault about why people think that this is being devalued. But what I do think is happening is that I think everyone is sort of playing to the natural incentives that exist within this ecosystem, and it's because it's very hard to understand what each kind of stakeholder is doing, and there's not enough transparency around how they're all aligning towards those incentives. I think it's easy to find kind of pockets of that ecosystem maybe not operating with the highest moral or ethical standards, and that kind of like drags down the common denominator, and then we start this kind of downward spiral of like pricing pressure, for example. Cheap SOC 2 audits to give you a checkbox so that you can just kind of pass an audit and close your deal. So All this to say that a big challenge that I think we're facing is a lack of transparency around what this artifact is serving, how effective it is relative to other potentially higher quality or higher standard versions of that artifact, and an opportunity in the space to figure out how could we broker a more kind of collaborative conversation around what good looks like for SOC 2, and how we could elevate that as a trust standard between organizations.
So do you think, I'm thinking about the history of SOC 2, and it's kind of ironic that we're having this conversation because I don't know if you recall, there was this thing called SAS 70 back in the days, which is kind of the granddaddy of SOC 2. And the issue was that it was really developed for companies that provide financial services, financial software. And the goal was really, okay, not only security, but also integrity of the software. Like if you run my general ledger on this thing, I want the numbers to stay the way I put them in. I don't want them to change inadvertently. But then for some reason, people decided to use it for more general purposes. Like, yeah, even if it's not a financial software, give me SAS 70 because that speaks to the controls like access control, software development, all of those things.
Yep.
And then they decided to split it into SOC 1 and SOC 2, and that's how we arrived with SOC 2. So the whole purpose behind SOC 2 was to really serve the purpose of the SaaS community, kind of give you assurance that you're getting good SaaS services. Yep. From either security availability perspective.
Yeah.
But then now we're back to questioning, I mean, how valuable is this thing?
Yep.
And because you did kind of something that piqued my attention, it seems like you have a lot of experience even outside of SOC 2. You're talking about FedRAMP, so NIST is probably something that you're quite familiar with, 853. Do you think it's the standard itself? It's just the commoditization of the SOC 2, and that's what makes it kind of questioning the viewer, or it could be applied to other certificates like ISO 27001. Like that's probably the second one after SOC 2, and outside of US, probably you can say that ISO 27000 is more popular than SOC 2.
Yeah.
So do you think that commoditization expands to other standards, or it's just kind of limited to SOC 2?
I do think it expands to other standards, and I think that something, and you'll find GRC LinkedIn talking about like ISO has the same problems. If you're especially talking to folks more in the EU orientation. Yeah. But something I think that we don't talk enough about is more of an underlying problem here, which is all of these standards and all of the assurance certifications and accreditations and reporting. The whole purpose of those is to provide a kind of cost-effective abstraction that demonstrates control health and effectiveness, because it is just like way too resource intensive and infeasible to go and manually and directly verify every single control that every single stakeholder wants to understand and know and have satisfied for every single interaction or transaction of assurance that you need with a particular system. It's just infeasible to do that, historically speaking. But what's interesting is that I think we are reaching a point where technology and deep integration through automated compliance, continuous compliance, more AI-based systems are giving us the opportunity to build infrastructure that connects more deeply into our systems that could enable actually a more frictionless and scalable way of demonstrating control health and effectiveness that does not need to rely solely on these kind of lossy abstractions as these kind of sole way of consuming and understanding control health and effectiveness for a given system or entity. And that's really exciting, because that's something that we could never have done, before even the past few years. But and that's why, like, this post, for example, was saying Vanta's a joke. I actually think Vanta's doing really, really cool and awesome things that have not been possible before. And Drata and Thoropass and Trustera is doing really cool stuff too. And I think all of us are working in the space to build ways for us to kind of come together and collaborate more effectively off the back of deeper integration, more automation, less just kind of like, trust me, I promise, and more about how can we demonstrate the continuous control effectiveness of our systems that we're trying to secure, and not just have to rely on these abstraction layers to convey that. So that's what I get excited about in the GRC space.
I kind of agree with you, because in my mind, this post made me think about the tool versus the utilization of the tool.
Absolutely.
So SOC 2 is a pretty good tool, actually, if you think about it.
Mhm.
But if you use it as the end goal, like this is be all and end all, that's what kind of creates this almost like a perverse
Yep.
use of the SOC 2. On the other hand, and I've done it before, if you take SOC 2 as the standard to start your security journey, but not to end it, kind of okay, that's and let's be honest, in a lot of the startup space and even in the small company space, the way you hear about SOC 2 is because you have a large client who says, I'm not going to buy from you unless you have SOC 2, right?
Mhm.
The necessary but not sufficient thing. And that kind of spurs a lot of wheels in the organization. Oh, let's get that SOC 2 because we have this big revenue stream hanging on it. And a smart person will use that as a driving force of, okay, we're going to get SOC 2, great, but are we secure enough?
Mm-hmm.
Can we use that as a driving force for us to improve our security?
Mm-hmm.
And if it is used that way, I think it's a really, really healthy tool. On the other hand, if it's just a check the box that we satisfy some salesperson to close the deal, I think that's the wrong way of dealing with SOC 2.
Yeah.
And to your point, a lot of companies like Vanta, Drata, and the others, they make it easy to get SOC 2, which is great. It's amazing, kind of bring it to the masses. But that may create the wrong perception that, yeah, we achieved this thing and it's easy and let's check the box and
Yes.
move on.
Yeah.
But you open the door for something else, which is very interesting, very interesting. Because all of these frameworks, and even if we go to a really high level frameworks like NIST 853, or we talk about the CSF, which is very popular nowadays. A lot of those frameworks are actually, all of them are used as a proxy for how well you do risk management. In a way, I don't really care about your SOC 2. I want to know that you have the right philosophy around security and you do proper risk management. That's what I'm after.
Mm-hmm.
And kind of one of the indicators that those frameworks are not sufficient is all the questionnaires that we share all around. I mean, give me your SOC 2, but by the way, fill in this questionnaire as well, because the questionnaire really reflects what is my interest in the risk, something that is really contextual for me, very specific for me, and that's why I'm asking these questions. Mm-hmm. To understand a little bit better. And those frameworks cover the 90% of the cases. That's why they're developed. They're developed mm-hmm. to cover the most of the cases, and we fill it in, and we're saying, yeah, I do proper risk management. By the way, this is the evidence that I do proper risk management.
Yeah.
And you open the door with mentioning AI, which is kind of interesting, because even with the audits, we have severe limitation in terms of resources. And that's why, for example, the auditors do samples. They don't look at the evidence for the control throughout the year or whatever the period is. They do sampling to give some level of confidence. So we have this severe limitation on the resources side. However, if we start utilizing AI, this seems like almost the perfect use case for the AI, dealing with a lot of data, mundane type of operations. And we can take it a step above. And here, probably I'm going to say something controversial. Why do we need frameworks? If I can use the AI to develop a control system that matches my particular risk profile and my priorities, then I can check these controls with AI, and then I can provide evidence that is specific for that use case. Now, even interesting on the other side, we started using AI to answer the questions, but that is not very well developed, but it's common nowadays to use AI to answer questions. Something else is happening on the other side. You use AI to develop the questionnaire, which is more interesting. Mm. So imagine I have an AI that looks at my risk profile, develops the proper controls, and develops the questionnaire, sends it to the other side. The other side uses the AI to answer the questions, bring it back, and my AI uses the questionnaire to interpret those answers. Mm-hmm. So in a way, we have one AI talking to another AI, each of them knowing exactly what is the risk posture of each company. So yes. in this kind of a futuristic world, do we even need frameworks?
Mm-hmm. That's a really good question. I think there's so many threads we can take that, but I think the bottom line for me is I think frameworks exist for a reason, and it's because people have a hard time when there's no structure. And I think structure
Yes.
helps
Yeah.
ground people, especially when you're talking about changing their interaction with technology and changing their workflows and changing their processes. And I think frameworks do serve as a normalization layer for effective change management, really. Like,
Standardization. Yeah.
yeah, if you're going to talk about, um, you know, throw your framework out, where do I begin? Like, oh, like what do I even have to? What should I even care about? And I think that, it's easy for folks, I think, in the platform and building and like product space to kind of think very futuristically and very like visionary about what the space could become. But at the end of the day, a lot of the practitioners I talk to are just trying to get the basics right, and they're just trying to start with, do I have IAM figured out? Do I have vulnerability management figured out? Like, agents, what? Like, I'm not doing AI stuff. Like, they're just trying to get the fundamentals solved, and the idea of kind of throwing out like this basic framework scaffolding for them would I think set them adrift a bit. So I do think that frameworks serve a purpose, and that they serve as like shared understanding that allows us to iterate towards more perhaps an open-ended future where you could be much more bespoke in what you're evaluating and how you evaluate and navigate that through the particular control landscape that you're working within. So
Yeah.
yeah.
That is kind of that is a good point. So we use frameworks as baseline, cover the basis, and then we can utilize AI to kind of fine tuning the situation, because we all know we start with SOC 2 or ISO 27000, and now we keep adding controls from other frameworks, or even more interestingly, bespoke controls that are just for our environment, kind of. And that's how we achieve to the common control framework that is such a popular thing nowadays.
Yeah.
Starting with something that is well known, like a framework, and then build on top of it and use AI to fine tune it. But there is a kind of another interesting component here, which is related to the human factor. And I've seen this in my days in the financial industry, because in the financial industry, as you know, it's heavily regulated, and we use a lot of frameworks all over the place, and we exchange results of all these examinations. By the way, examinations are higher level than the audits and all that kind of stuff. But ultimately, you look at all these credentials that you share, and ultimately you want to talk to the person who runs the thing. You want to have a conversation and figure out how they think about risk. What is their philosophy in terms of risk management and security? And very often that is the determining factor. And because we know there is always going to be findings, there are going to be always something that needs to be done. And at least from my perspective, maybe it's more important, where is the mindset of the person who's responsible for this thing?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that also comes down to one of the complaints that a lot of folks are expressing with SOC 2 these days, is that the quality of the artifact and the evaluation varies so much. And I keep poking people when they say that. I'm just like, what does that mean to you? Like, quality is so subjective, but what does good look like for these evaluations? And I think that, George, what you just said, like, you want to get into their mindset. I would want to understand specifically, what do you want to understand about how they evaluate control effectiveness in like their sampling methodology or their testing methodology or whatever that is. But like, let's make that the standard, or like make that the conversation, so that instead of us worrying about, is this SOC 2 good, bad, or okay, or whatever, we can all say, like, here's sort of like the spectrum of things that create concern with how these documents typically get delivered and how they typically get kind of structured and tested. And we can just have an objective review that says, like, typically, sampling methodology that's limited to like, I don't know, 2 months or 3 months or whatever is not quite as effective as something that's looking retrospectively over the course of like 6 to 12 months or something like that. I would love to see more of a way for folks to have a conversation around SOC 2 quality that does not just say, like, certain audit firms are bad. There's a blacklist out there. We won't tell you what it is, but you know if you know. And I'm just like, most people don't know, which brings me kind of like the overarching point here, which is that it comes back to incentives. This ecosystem and the SOC 2 has come to the forefront because it is a cheap and easy to procure, if you want it to be, way to unblock enterprise revenue. And because of that, like, obviously, like, we have all of the cascading problems off the back of that. But at the same time, they're using that artifact. Vendors and suppliers are using that artifact to close deals. So like, if we really want something to change here, people who are buying that or buying that supplier and like receiving the kind of low quality SOC 2 have to look at that thing and say, this doesn't smell right. And there needs to be sort of a pushback from the commercial perspective around like, no, we know what good looks like, and this isn't it, and we're not going to accept that anymore. Because if that started happening more often, I bet you would see a lot of platforms, for example, start introducing guardrails, start introducing like quality checks around, auditor reputation, or like, quality of the artifact, or like, exhaustiveness of testing or something like that. That just doesn't happen today very much.
Yeah, that's actually an interesting point that at least in the audit world, it's either you're accredited to do the audit or you're not in a particular standard. But we, as you said, we both know that there are different levels of quality of how this is done. And I don't know if you heard it, but dealing with, especially with engineering folks, very often they have a very low opinion of the auditors in the security space. They have a very low opinion because they haven't found this or they didn't discover that. And my point is, that they're not really doing forensic audit. They're relying on what you tell them and what they see, and they provide an opinion. And it's important actually for our community to really understand what is the role of the auditor and what they do and what they promise, what they guarantee, versus what they not. And if you look at all the disclaimers in a SOC 2 report, for example, you see that, the level of assurance is not as high as some people think it is.
Yep, exactly. The marketing around SOC 2 has been phenomenally transformed over the past couple of years. It's crazy. I think I saw.
Thank you, Vanta.
Yeah. Well,
let me ask a little bit of a question about a tangential question about that. As a marketing guy I'm really only 2.5 years into my journey of security and compliance, and this might seem like a simple question. When I look back and I think about like how this conversation started for me and how I came across you, Henry, you see these posts about SOC 2 being insufficient and not being a great standard. Why is everybody so upset about that? If the idea of SOC 2 does raise everybody up to a certain standard at least, and maybe there's more to be there's more to be desired. Why do you think that gets everybody's goat so much? Why is everybody so up in arms about it?
I mean, I have
Is it just on social media?
I think it's it's fun to have an enemy, and it's also good that enemy isn't personalized. It's kind of like a concept. I do have to point out that a lot of the noise comes from audit firms who may be feeling like pricing pressure, and worried about like the devaluation of their practice and their industry, which is valid. Very concerning. Like if you are getting undercut by crappy quality products, like that's not fun. So it's in your best interest to kind of raise everyone's awareness around like what good looks like and what good doesn't look like. And I also think that, obviously on everyone's mind also, increasingly is just like supply chain and vendor risk is increasingly important, and enterprise trust as a kind of risk domain and kind of like an operational domain for suppliers and buyers is increasingly important. So it puts more scrutiny on like, okay, so what are the interfaces that we have to exchange data, understand each other's control and assurance posture? How do we what levers do we have to pull if it's not up to our standard? Like how do we navigate that relationship in the context of, the commercial engagement that we're dealing with? So all of that stuff is increasingly complicated. And because of the SaaS sprawl and like the growth of the supply chain, like it's all increasingly coming to the fore. So I think all of these factors are playing a part in why this conversation is top of mind for folks. I'm sure there's other reasons that I'm missing, but that's what I see at least.
So, Henry, how do you see, like, I agree with you on the quality of this, but let's think about the reality. Usually this report is reviewed by somebody in procurement or somebody in the security space, and they don't review one, they have to review 50 or 60 or 100. So there is this, again, problem with the resources, overloading. So how do we approach this? Because if we start demanding a higher quality will come. How do we approach that?
It's a good question. I mean, and I certainly empathize with the challenge here. Just even yesterday, I was talking to the head of TPRM for like a mid-sized bank. They have to review, hundreds of vendors annually, and they're leaning on the SOC 2. And for SOX compliance reasons, they actually need to maintain a thorough audit trail of how they've evaluated that artifact. What they were able to glean from it. Did they go through the user entity controls? Did they get acceptance from the business about how they're going to go implement those? Did they, kind of follow through on implementation of those compensating controls? Like it's many, many hours per vendor specifically for that artifact, in addition to all of the other assurance, criteria that they're evaluating that vendor against. So it's certainly load on those teams. But your question really is like, how do we change? How do we level up here? How do we make this easier for folks? I mean, it's very complicated. It's a very complicated question, but I think the answer is simple. It's like, I think there needs to be more transparency on both sides about kind of what is being provided in terms of the assurance. And then from the kind of buyer perspective, sort of what those expectations are. And I think there's an opportunity here for platform partners in the middle who are providing services and enable.
Like we stick.
Yeah. Well, yeah, not just on the trust center and assurance side, but also on the TPRM and like kind of GRC side from evaluating a vendor risk perspective. There's an opportunity to elevate the questions around what exactly is important to you, what matters to your organization, what data do you have available to you to satisfy your desire for assurance about that control, and how effectively can we give you data, like verifiable data, that demonstrates that control is effective and satisfactory to your standard. And today, like the reason, like I was saying before, that I think SOC 2 is increasingly popular is because it is a very efficiently machined abstraction of a lot of different controls that a lot of people, collectively sort of want. And we're kind of in this lowest common denominator moment that's sort of like pushing us down in terms of quality, so to speak. But I do think that, like I was saying before, with the onset of increasing integration and automation on both sides of this equation, from the supplier side and the buyer side, there is a big opportunity here to enable a more frictionless exchange of the criteria and requirements that matter to you from a control effectiveness standpoint, and in a real-time demonstration of that control effectiveness back to your customer in an authorized, kind of permissible and governed state to frankly deliver higher assurance faster, more directly tied to what you care about, rather than relying on some like point in time abstraction that might not be as might be of inconsistent quality. So that's how.
Yeah, so it's almost like up to date, real time. What is your portion, and what kind of evidence you can give me to substantiate that this is your real portion.
Exactly. And we're on that track already. I mean, if you look at trust centers kind of categorically, those who are offering trust centers off the back of integrated GRC platforms like Vanta, Strata, you see the onset of continuous compliance, right? You see the onset of like, hey, here's a real-time verification of this control. It's operational. What you don't see is that information stops at the trust center. So if you are a buyer, you are always going to be going to that trust center if you want to use that interface and trying to glean what you can from a green checkbox, which is not much better than a yes or a no on a questionnaire. But it is closer to this world where, what if you could have that data independently verified and delivered into whatever like GRC platform that you're using to verify and monitor that vendor's posture? Like that's different than what a trust center can deliver today.
Henry, I'll throw the softball to you. Isn't this what Fabrik does?
This is Fabrik's vision for the trust ecosystem: connectivity, data connectivity across trust platforms. Real time data connectivity across the trust ecosystem. Yeah, exactly.
I cannot wait to see this thing. It's going to help us a lot. And you mentioned something that kind of piqued my interest, which is around trust between enterprises and how transparency is an enabler for the trust. And again, it's related to what you guys are doing. So it's interesting to hear your review. How far do you think we should take that transparency?
I think that is totally up for the market to decide. I think that there is a role, of course, that regulation can play. I think that will be a lagging force behind where the market decides is possible and acceptable. Like today, I don't think regulation is going to get us there. But what I do think is possible is for purchasing organizations that have a lot of leverage or a lot of pull, or through like a very large contract value, a large reputation, et cetera, who really deeply care about supply chain security, vendor risk. They're likely going to be able to start pulling more and more assurance data out of their supply chain in the form of, hey, like I want to start seeing, like, direct pen test results as a starting point. And now I want to start seeing like access logs for, particular kinds of events, or I want to start seeing like a real-time demonstration of effectiveness of like your MFA controls across this subset of your applications. And like, how do they achieve that today? They build custom integrations into your AWS console. Like that's just not tenable at scale, but we do see large financial institutions, for example, with that kind of sway and those kinds of resources starting to knock on suppliers' doors with those kinds of questions. What we see as missing is a way for the ecosystem to enable that transparency balanced with the overhead of doing that, right? Of actually building custom integrations, and also with the right level of sort of governance and agreed upon disclosure, because you don't want to just open, your whole internal infrastructure to any customer that comes knocking. Obviously, it's not fun, but there needs to be some sort of equilibrium around responsible disclosure through more accessible and real-time means, balanced against sort of like what the buyer is entitled to, given kind of what their their leverage of their contract might dictate.
Yeah. And on the buyer side, also having the capability to analyze the information that you receive, because we're not at that level. I mean, you're talking about sharing evidence, which is really, really interesting. And in some cases, going back to the fact that I want to talk to the person, yes, that will show how we deal with evidence, what is our philosophy around this. But also on the buyer side, the ability to ingest that information, analyze it, and come to the right conclusions.
Yeah, you're absolutely spot on. I think enterprise trust is a category, but like enterprise trust, TPRM, GRC, trust centers, all of that, it is a wonderful dance of maturity between big mature organizations and teeny bitty organizations who have nothing, and right sizing the kind of implications of that maturity or lack thereof in the TPR workflow. Large financial services companies sending a tiny startup a 500 question questionnaire is like, what are they going to do with that? But the point I was going to make is that in this world of kind of maturity mismatches, what is possible, what is interesting, is to broker and kind of transparently, this is kind of how Fabrik sees the world, but is to broker connectivity right-sized to the level of maturity that both entities are at. So, for example, what if you are able to get your questionnaire automatically fulfilled right within your TPRM platform instantly based on assurance data that a vendor maintains in their trust center, based on like their SOC 2 or their policies and procedures and control statements, stuff like that.
Don't even need to send that questionnaire.
Don't even need to set the questionnaire. Taking that a step further, what if you could get your questionnaire answered based on data that was independently provided by integration from that supplier into their controls posture? And that question, the simple question, do you have this thing? Is it effective? Is being satisfied not by a policy or a SOC 2, but like a real-time verification of that control actually being enforced by that GRC platform on the supplier side. Like that is a maturity question on the supplier side, matching a maturity position on the buyer side.
On the buyer side.
Exactly.
And even if we take it a step further, because controls are, again, they're proxy for risk management, ideally, I would like to be able to send open-ended questions and get the answers based on the control posture and based on the evidence and all this connectivity that you're talking about. Because we don't want to kind of limit ourselves in, I can answer the question about ISO 2 or SD 5 or something like that. It has to be open-ended. Like, how do you do secure development? And show me that you're actually doing proper SASD and DASD.
Yeah, exactly. And that's something that, I mean, trust centers today, I think, are doing fairly well, but there's a lot of challenges with that, because what you're talking about is an unstructured situation, right? You're asking an open-ended question into an unstructured database of like knowledge bases or question answer pairs, or even just like control information. You're saying, go figure it out. And suppliers get really, trust and assurance teams get kind of skittish about just opening themselves up for automation to go answer questions on their behalf without the right level of visibility and control about how they are being represented to their customers.
Yep.
Well, I think we're coming up against our time here. I don't want to keep Henry too long. So, Henry, how do people find you, and how do people find Fabrik?
How do you find us? You can visit us at thetrustfabrik.com. That you can kind of see a bit more about what we're up to. But you can also find me on LinkedIn. I'm pretty chatty and love to connect with new folks. I'm on LinkedIn at Henry Makes Things is my kind of LinkedIn back handle. So you can find me there.
He's running LinkedIn GRC.
Not running it, just kind of rallying a few folks around some interesting topics.
Yeah, Henry, your company doing some really, really interesting stuff, and you're helping us with exactly that kind of enterprise trust relation, enterprise to somebody, other enterprise or another company relationship. So yeah, definitely people should check you out. It's
amazing,
pretty cool.
We appreciate that. Yeah, thank you so much. Thanks so much for having me.
Yeah, thanks so much for joining us today, Henry. And yeah, stay tuned for the next one. Make sure to go visit thetrustfabrik.com and follow Henry on LinkedIn. Thanks, everybody.
Yep. Thanks, Henry. Thank you.